In 1935, Will Durant published this book. This is Our Oriental Heritage. It's the first volume in his 5-volume series on the history of civilization. 40 years later, in 1975, he still hadn't finished the series, and in fact, he never would finish the series. And today, we're going to look at his original plan, which was for 5 volumes, and how that plan changed, and how it became 11 volumes. And then we're going to look at the rest of the things that are in the preface to this one, to preface to volume 1. Hello, and welcome back to What's Past is Prologue. This is the channel where we talk about the story of civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. And today, I thought we could look at some of the things that Durant wrote in the preface. So this is Durant. I'm gonna read it to you now. This is Durant talking about what he intends to do. The plan of the series is to narrate the history of civilization in 5 independent parts. Part 1, Our Oriental Heritage, a history of civilization in Egypt and the Near East to the death of Alexander, and in India, China and Japan to the present day, with an introduction of the nature and elements of civilization. Part 2, Our Classical Heritage, a history of civilization in Greece and Rome, and of civilization in the Near East under Greek and Roman domination. Part 3, Our Medieval Heritage, Catholic and feudal Europe, Byzantine civilization, Mohammedan and Judaic culture in Asia, Africa and Spain, and the Italian Renaissance. Part 4, Our European Heritage, the cultural history of the European states from the Protestant Reformation to the French Revolution. Part 5, Our Modern Heritage, the history of European invention and statesmanship, science and philosophy, religion and morals, literature and art, from the accession of Napoleon to our own times. That was Durant's original plan, and well, it didn't go according to plan. One of the things that Durant tells us in the preface is that he has a time frame for when this series is going to be completed. So this book, the first book, comes out in 1935, and then he says that if the initial book is a success, he will continue the series and he will write 5 volumes. And so the second volume will come out. They will come out at 5-year intervals. So the second volume will come out in 1940, and then 1945, and then the 4th volume will come out in 1950, and then the final volume will come out in 1955. This time frame proved very difficult for Durant, and by difficult I mean he didn't keep to it at all. Nevertheless, he does manage to keep on track, at least initially, with his plan. So the first volume, Our Oriental Heritage, does stick to the plan. So he manages to complete the history of India, China and Japan up to the present day, without being the 1930s. And he does cover more or less the Middle East up to the death of Alexander, which is in 323 BC. So the original Our Oriental Heritage is still sticking to the plan. Where the plan starts to go slightly awry is when he hits the second volume, which he intended to cover classical antiquity, and by that I mean ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But he clearly found that he had too much material to cover both Greece and Rome in just one volume. So what he does is he splits it into 2. So he has a volume on Greece, the life of Greece, which comes out in 1940, and he has a volume on Rome, which is called Caesar and Christ, because it covers Roman civilization plus the beginnings of Christianity. And that comes out in 1944. So by the time he's completed what will be his 3rd volume, he's already sort of 4 years behind in his original plan. But he wanted to cover them in more detail, and they're both, I think, terrific volumes. So I think we should be pleased that he didn't stick to his original plan. Then we come to what was originally planned for the 3rd volume, Our Medieval Heritage. Again, he's got far too much material. I think he underestimated the scope of the project. So he decides to split it off into 2. The first one being what becomes the Age of Faith. So Our Medieval Heritage is basically the Age of Faith, but what he excludes is the Renaissance. And he splits the Renaissance off from the 3rd volume, and it becomes its own volume. But it's quite short. It's compared to the Age of Faith, it's about 400 pages shorter as a volume. But the Renaissance, it gets its own volume. Just the Italian Renaissance is dedicated to it, and that becomes volume 5, which comes out in 1953. He's over halfway to completing his project, but he's but he's completely off track in terms of his timescale. One of the things that I find really interesting as I was reading all the different prefaces to the volumes is that at every stage, when he writes the preface to every book, he lays out what he intends to do and what the next volume is going to be and how long the series is going to be. And every single time he gets it wrong. Every single time he completely underestimates what he's going to do. And so when we get to volume 6, the Reformation, which comes out in 1957, he says in that preface, "Don't worry, I know I've spent far too long and I've written far too many volumes, but I'm going to wrap up the series. Okay, so I'm gonna write this volume, the Reformation, and then I'm gonna write one more volume, and it's gonna be called The Age of Reason. And the Age of Reason is gonna go from the end of the Reformation all the way to the French Revolution, and then that's gonna be it. That's gonna be the series over. Just one more volume. So every single time, he underestimates what he's ultimately gonna do, and he underestimates how much material he has to cover. So to me, it's just really funny that his plans just never work out as he intended. Even in 1957, he's still underestimating the overall series. Obviously, between finishing Volume 6 and starting Volume 7, Durant decides, no, I'm going to have to change the plan again because I've got far too much material. So what he decides to do, he releases Volume 7. It is The Age of Reason, but he changes the title to The Age of Reason Begins, because he never finished. That's just the beginning of the Age of Reason. He doesn't actually finish the Age of Reason. So he takes the story up to 1650. And in the preface to Volume 7, we get the first mentions of what will become 2 new volumes. So he clearly has decided on 2 titles. So he's going to write The Age of Voltaire and The Age of Louis XIV. This is the first time we get mention of those potential new volumes. And they would become volumes 8 and 9. But he promises the reader, don't worry, look, I've spent so long writing this series, but I'm going to wrap it up with The Age of Voltaire. 9 volumes and we're done. He gets to the 8th volume, The Age of Louis XIV, and he writes in the preface, and I thought I would read this to you because I think it's kind of revealing about what happened. This is a quote from the preface to Volume 8 now. This came out in 1963. Some difficulties have arisen partly from the wealth of material offered by the 18th century, all demanding study and space. Meanwhile, we shall rely on the great powers not to destroy our subject before it destroys us. Some difficulties have arisen for Will Durant in completing the series. So in other words, he can't stop writing. Like, he just has to keep going, which is great because we get all these extra volumes. When I first read that quote, I was kind of curious as to what he meant by the great powers destroying our subject before it destroys us. And then I went back and looked at the date that the 8th volume was published, and I realized immediately what was going on. When he says, we will rely on the great powers not to destroy our subject before it destroys us. This volume came out in 1963. And I'm sure most people will realize, but in November of 1960, I think it was November of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis hit. And there was a very real possibility, and people were speculating on whether or not civilization would be completely destroyed by a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Durant is, in this quote, he's speculating on one of 3 possibilities is going to happen. Either we're going to get wiped out in a nuclear war, or he's going to die before he finishes the series, or he's going to finish the series. And he's kind of trying to figure out which is going to happen first. By the time we get to the 10th volume, Rousseau and Revolution, Durant has... One of the things you notice is that Durant has slowed down. He's not covering history as fast as he once did. So it's interesting to compare the Age of Faith with what happens when he gets to the 18th century. So with the Age of Faith, he covers 1,000 years, 1 volume. When we get to the 18th century, he covers 74 years from the death of Louis XIV to the Bastille in 1789, but it takes him 2 volumes to cover 74 years. It takes him all of the Age of Voltaire and all of Rousseau and Revolution, 10th volume. So he's slowed right down by the time we get to the 18th century. So when we get to the 10th volume, Rousseau and Revolution, the Durants have made it clear they've written the story of civilization up till the Bastille, up till 1789, and at that point they are done. They are finished with civilization. They've completed their project. They're not going to write anymore. They're not gonna write our modern heritage, but they've completed it at this point. Which the Age of Rousseau and Revolution comes out in 1967, and at this point, I think Will Durant must be in his 70s. So they've decided, that's it, they're done. Not gonna write anymore. But of course, again, they're wrong, because they write one more volume, and in the 11th volume, The Age of Napoleon, this is what Durant writes. I'm gonna again read you a brief quote from the preface. He says, "We offer no better reason than to say that the Reaper has repeatedly overlooked us and left us to passive living and passive reading after 1968. We grew weary of this insipid and unaccustomed leisure." I think it's a good quote, because I think that this project, the Story of Civilization project, became their life's work. It became kind of their obsession. And so what seems to have happened is they just got into the habit of researching and writing these books, and so they just couldn't stop. And it's a really good thing that they couldn't stop, because I'm of the view that having a purpose, having a sense of direction, having a goal to try and achieve really keeps you healthy. It keeps you mentally healthy, keeps you physically healthy, if you have a sense of purpose and direction, if you aren't aimless. And after they completed Rousseau, like the Age of Napoleon, the Age of Napoleon gave them a sense of direction for those next few years. And so that came out in 1975, and there was a goal to write The Age of Darwin and The Age of Einstein, but I think if we're being realistic, there's no way that they could have covered the 19th century in just one volume. The pace at which the Durants were writing by the 1970s was so compact and slow that it's not that they were writing slowly, it's that they carried on adding more and more and more detail to what they were writing. And so I think the 19th century, the Age of Darwin, would have ended up becoming 2 volumes again. And I think The Age of Einstein would have again ended up becoming 2 volumes. I would have loved to have The Age of Darwin. I think it would have been a terrific volume, but we just never got it. And I think there are notes for it somewhere, but it was never published. And so it's a shame, but we should be grateful for the fact that we got 11 volumes. I would also note that the Durants, let's say they'd lived another 20 or 30 years or something, I think that what would have happened is they would have carried on going. They would have written another 4 volumes on European civilization. But I know that the Durants also wanted to write the history of the Americas. So, they wanted to write not only the history of the United States, but they wanted to write the history of the Mayan civilization and the Aztecs and various Central and South American civilizations. And they also wanted to write a lot about colonial America. I mean, we don't really hear a lot about colonial America, but the Durants were really interested in writing like the history of the Americas, because the Americas are more or less absent from the story of civilization. And of course, you can't have a complete story of civilization without talking about the Americas, right? It's a very important part of civilization. So they wanted to cover that, but again, they just ran out of time. They couldn't even complete the rest of civilization, let alone getting to the Americas. So it's a shame that we didn't get more, but we got so much that we should be grateful for what we did get. The 5-volume series becomes 11 volumes ultimately. But there are one or two other things in the preface that I want to talk about, because Durant doesn't just outline his plan for the series, he also talks importantly about the type of history that he wants to write. And so I thought I would read a quote from the preface where he explains specifically what type of history is Durant interested in writing. Okay, so this is again from the preface. Durant states, "I have long felt that our usual method of writing history in separate longitudinal sections, economic history, political history, religious history, the history of philosophy, the history of literature, the history of science, the history of music, the history of art, does injustice to the unity of human life. That history should be written collaterally as well as linearly, synthetically as well as analytically, and that the ideal historiography would seek to portray in each period the total complex of a nation's culture, institutions, adventures, and ways. But the accumulation of knowledge has divided history, like science, into 1,000 isolated specialties, and prudent scholars have refrained from attempting any view of the whole, whether of the material universe or of the living past of our race. For the probability of error increases with the scope of the undertaking, and any man who sells his soul to synthesis will be a tragic target for a myriad merry darts of specialist critique." One of the things you might notice about this quote is that Durant is trying to balance out the immodesty of the project with the humility of his own nature. He's saying to the reader, look, I can't be a specialist in all these different areas, and so this general history is inevitably going to be is going to receive valid criticisms in some respects. But he's hoping that by just being upfront and acknowledging that the reader will forgive him and allow him to write about various different topics. Incidentally, this channel has the same problem in that by me following Durant section by section, there are inevitably going to be people say, well, how can you cover all these different topics? And the answer to that I'm going to give is I'm just going to cover them as best that I can. I don't claim to be an expert in everything. Another thing you might notice is that the final line of the quote, the final line in that, is filled with alliteration. So he says, he's going to be the tragic target, and he uses the words myriad and merry when he's describing darts. So this is clear use of alliteration to try and really bring home the point that he's trying to make. Another thing worth noting in the quote is Durant makes this distinction between analytical history and synthetic history, and I think most people probably understand what that means instinctively, but in case you don't, I'm going to try and explain it, because it wasn't, when I first read the volume, it wasn't clear to me exactly what he meant between what the distinction was between analytical and synthetic, because I'd never really thought about the meaning of those words. Both of these words, you're talking about analysis and synthesis, and these are Greek words of Greek origin. And so, what is the distinction between analysis and a synthesis? What do these things mean? So, an analysis, you take a thing, whatever that thing may be, and you break it down into its component parts, and you examine the component parts in order to try and understand the whole thing itself. So in the case of history, you take a specific period of history or a specific type of history, economic history, for example, and you look at economic history and you use that to try and understand the whole. Like, how does economic history explain history, right? That's an analysis. A synthesis is different in that what you're doing is you're taking the component parts of a thing and you're bringing them together, and then you're examining how the component parts interact with each other. So in the case of these books, we're talking about, like, how does economic history affect political history? How does political history affect military history, and so on and so forth? So with an analysis, you break it apart into its component parts. With a synthesis, you bring it together in order to try and in both situations, you're trying to understand the thing. So Durant very much wants to do a synthesis of history. So does he achieve this? This is a question we could ask. Like, is this series a success from the perspective of a synthesis? Well, what's interesting about the series and interesting about the volumes is the distinction between analysis and synthesis in historical terms depends entirely on your perspective. Okay, take the second volume, take The Life of Greece. The Life of Greece is arguably both an analysis and a synthesis, depending on where it's placed. So it is a synthesis of Greek history from Mycenaean Greece to the end of the Hellenistic period. So that's a synthesis of Greek history. But the volume itself is a component part of a wider series, the Story of Civilization. So if you step back and look at it as just one component part of an overall series, then that volume works as both an analysis and a synthesis. So in some sense, this distinction is not quite as it's not quite as clear as some people might think, right? Like, it kind of depends upon your perspective of whether this is a synthesis or analysis. I should also say that there are different types of synthesis, right? So you can have like chemical synthesis, and you can have like musical synthesis, I think. But this is he's just talking about synthesis in respect to history. So I hope that made it clear if you didn't know what he was talking about. You can see this volume, this particular cover, this particular issue doesn't have a dust jacket to it. But obviously I've got volumes up there that do have dust jackets. And so when I was reading the dust jacket, I found one thing that I thought was kind of funny and interesting. And so on the dust jacket, it states that Durant's original plan, before he came up with the 5-volume plan for civilization, was that he was going to write the history of the 19th century. That was his original plan. But what happened was, when he was reading up about the 19th century, he found that he couldn't really understand or explain the 19th century without first going back to the 18th century and thinking about, like, what were the things that were happening in the 18th century that were affecting the 19th century. And so he went back to the 18th century. And then when he got there, of course, he found he couldn't really understand the 18th century without first going back to the 17th century. I think you can probably figure out where I'm going with this, right? So he kept going back century after century after century because he couldn't explain the present without understanding the past. And so this pushed him all the way back to human prehistory. And this is the origin of the story of civilization, because for Durant, of course, what's past is prologue, and so he has to read the prologue before he can understand the past. I think what I found interesting and kind of funny about this was that his original plan to write a history of the 19th century, he never got to the 19th century, right? He kept going back century after century after century, and so he never even got to his original goal. He never got to the 19th century, which I find is kind of like, it's kind of amusing. So yeah, it's worth reading. If you have these books, it's worth reading the Dust Jacket, because there's always one or two interesting things on the Dust Jacket. There's one other thing that I should probably talk about before we get into chapter 1, which will be in the next video, about about the first volume, particularly the first volume, and that is the title of the first volume, Our Oriental Heritage. I guess it's kind of like there's kind of a controversy or whatever with regards to the word Orient. So I thought I would talk about the word Orient just briefly, and say what that means in the context of 2024, which is when I'm filming this video. So, why is there a problem with the word Orient? What is the word Orient all about? The word Orient, as it was used in the 1930s, when we think about something like Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, is the Orient really meant what is today what we consider Asia, right? It was the distinction between the West is considered the Occident and the East is considered the Orient. And so there are a lot of issues that are raised when you try and make a distinction between East and West. So first of all, people debate, like scholars debate, is this a meaningful distinction? Is the East-West divide important? You may have an opinion on that. I don't know. It's up to you to make your own decisions about these things. But then there's a question of like, where does the East begin and the West end? Where's the division between East-West? And during the Cold War, the East-West division was the Iron Curtain, which was really Central Europe. But no, that East-West division has gone, and so the Orient historically seems to have been primarily basically Constantinople, right? So European Turkey, what is today Turkey, is considered part of the Occident, and the Orient begins on the other side of Constantinople, over the Sea of Marmara, the Dardanelles, into what historically was considered Asia Minor. So that's the distinction between the Occident and the Orient. But the word Orient has taken on a different context, and I think that the primary reason for this is the work of Edward Said. So I never know what people know, so I'm going to just explain. Edward Said was a Palestinian American citizen, and he was a public intellectual, a critic, and he wrote a book in 1978 called Orientalism. It's a very famous book, very well talked about and studied and so forth. And the premise of this book, the premise of Orientalism, was this idea that in the West, in the Occident, there were depictions of the East which were inappropriate or kind of unflattering. And so the East and West was always contrasted, right? So for Edward Said, the West was considered rational, whereas the East was considered irrational. The West was considered chaste, and the East was considered licentious. The West was civilized, the East was barbaric, and the various other kinds of things, where the West had a culture that was dynamic, whereas the East had a culture that was static. And what Edward Said was saying was that this was a bad thing, that these depictions of the Orient were what he considered Orientalism, that is, the West depicting the Orient in an inappropriate way. And ever since Edward Said published this book, maybe even before this, but I think that Orientalism was the primary reason why this happened, the word Orient has basically disappeared from modern writing. People don't talk about the Orient anymore. Nowadays, if this book were published, if Our Oriental Heritage were published today, it would probably be called Our Asian Heritage. Because people don't have a problem with the word Asia, but they do have a problem with the word Orient. I think one question we could ask is Durant guilty of Orientalism, right? Did he Orientalize Asia? or people in Asia and culture in Asia? Is he guilty of the thing that I would say to criticize people in the West for doing? Is he that kind of person? I think that the answer is no. I think the very title itself is a kind of rebuke to the idea that Durant is engaged in Orientalism, because the title is Our Oriental Heritage. So what he's saying in this book is that a lot of what we consider to be Western traditions and Western ideas have Oriental origins, right? They come from either the Middle East, or they come from the Far East, or they come from India, or wherever, and that we shouldn't consider that the West is somehow, the Occident is somehow completely distinguished from the Orient, and that there's an interaction between the Orient and the Occident. And so I don't think that Durant is guilty of Orientalism. I mean, there are moments of like where Durant kind of exoticizes the mysterious East or whatever. He does do that a little bit, but that's usually kind of like a poetic flourish. I don't think it's really a genuine opinion of Durant. I don't think there's no prejudice in Durant. Very, very little stuff that you would say is kind of controversial. What I think is interesting about this Oriental, the kind of prohibition on the word Orientalism or Orient, is that what seems to have happened is that people have abandoned the word Orient, but they haven't abandoned Orientalism, right? You still get depictions of Asia which are kind of like caricatures. You still don't get like the full complexity of Asia. You never could. It's too complex for any one person to really understand, or depict properly. But like you still get cliches and all that kind of stuff. So people have held on to Orientalism whilst abandoning the word Orient, which I don't think is really kind of progress myself. I don't think that's really a good thing. But yeah, I wanted to talk about that, because I'm sure that there are people who are going to say, well, how can you review a book that has the word Orient in it? Isn't that just so incredibly inappropriate? And I think the answer is no. I don't really think so. I don't think we should allow that to diminish our enjoyment of the books. There's one more quote that I'd like to read to you now, which is from the preface. This is Durant writing about a Chinese historian. He states, Tai T'ung, who in the 13th century issued his History of Chinese Writing with these words, "Were I to await perfection, my book would never be finished." I want to mention that quote because this is my philosophy. This is what is going to become my philosophy of this channel. Were I to await perfection, these videos would never be finished. The next video, which will not be perfect, will be on Chapter 1 of Volume 1, and it will be the conditions of civilization. Durant has certain conditions that he thinks are important with the development of civilization. He's going to talk about them in Chapter 1, and so I will make a video on Chapter 1 soon, and then that will be published on this channel. And if you'd like to join me for that, that would be great. And if you wouldn't, then that's fine too. Hope you have a nice day, whatever it is you're doing, and I'll see you later. Bye.